The knock on my door at midnight was an intrusion, a percussive shock against the quiet hum of my life. Rain lashed against the windows of my small apartment, a frantic, rhythmic drumming that had been the sole companion to my solitude for hours. I was used to the solitude. I had curated it, polished it like a precious stone until it shone with the dull gleam of resignation. My life was a series of quiet routines. The click of my keyboard as I finished a design project, the scent of brewing tea, the weight of a book in my lap. It was a safe life, a predictable one, a lonely one. The knock came again, harder this time, impatient. I wasn't expecting anyone. My social circle was small and well-managed. They texted. This was something else. This was an anomaly. I padded to the door, my bare feet cold on the hardwood floor, and peered through the peephole. The distorted, fisheye view showed me a man in a pilot's uniform, his shoulders broad, his dark hair plastered to his forehead by the rain. For a disoriented second, my brain failed to compute. Then, my heart gave a painful, stupid lurch. It was Julian. Julian Thorne, my best friend Chloe's older brother. The man who had unknowingly occupied a significant and heavily fortified portion of my brain space since I was 17 years old. He was the sun-drenched photograph on Chloe's mantelpiece, the casual, confident voice on the other end of her phone calls, the walking, breathing embodiment of everything I was not. And he was on my doorstep, at midnight, in a storm. I fumbled with the deadbolt, my fingers suddenly clumsy. I pulled the door open, and the storm swept in, a gust of wind and rain that smelled of wet asphalt and ozone. He stood there, dripping on my welcome mat, his pilot's bag slung over one shoulder. He looked exhausted, the usually sharp lines of his face softened by fatigue, but his eyes, a deep, startling blue, were just as intense as I remembered. They found mine, and a slow smile, a familiar, devastatingly charming smile, spread across his lips. "Leo," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate right through the floorboards. "Sorry about this. I know it's late. Jules, what are you doing here?" My own voice was a croak. I cleared my throat, trying to sound less like a startled frog. "Flight got canceled. Storms got everything grounded until morning, maybe longer. Chloe said you were near the airport." He gestured vaguely behind him, into the tempest. "Every hotel room within a 50-mile radius is booked solid. She volunteered your couch." Of course she did. Chloe operated on a level of social audacity I could only dream of. The thought of her, warm and dry in her own home, casually offering up my sanctuary, made me want to both strangle her and thank her. My mind was a frantic scramble of conflicting thoughts. Julian, here, in my apartment, all night. The sheer, terrifying domesticity of it was overwhelming. The fossilized crush, the one I kept pressed between the pages of my memory like a dead flower, stirred with an unwelcome flicker of life. "Right? Yeah, of course," I managed, stepping back to let him in. "Come on, get out of the rain." He stepped inside, bringing the storm with him. The scent of his cologne, a clean, sharp fragrance I vaguely recognized, mingled with the smell of wet wool from his uniform jacket. He filled my small entryway, his presence so large and solid it seemed to shrink the very walls around me. My apartment, my carefully controlled space, suddenly felt impossibly small, charged with an energy it wasn't built to contain. He shrugged off his heavy bag, letting it drop to the floor with a solid thud that seemed to punctuate his arrival. He looked around, taking in my small living room, the stacks of books, the art prints on the wall, the half-finished mug of tea on the coffee table. His gaze lingered for a moment before returning to me. He ran a hand through his damp hair, pushing it back from his forehead, and offered me another one of those tired, apologetic smiles. "We'll figure it out," he said. And with those four simple words, my quiet, predictable world tilted on its axis. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a promise of collaboration. My heart picked up a frantic pace, a frantic, stupid drumbeat against the rhythm of the rain. The first hour was a blur of awkward hospitality. I found him a towel, one of the good ones I saved for guests who never materialized. He disappeared into my small bathroom, and I stood in the living room, listening to the sound of the shower running, my mind a blank, buzzing hive. The sound was so intimate, so profoundly out of place in my silent home. It was the sound of another life, another person's routine, intersecting with mine. I busied myself making tea, my hands shaking slightly as I measured the loose leaves. It was a mundane task, a familiar ritual, but it felt different, freighted with a new significance. I was making tea for Julian. He emerged a few minutes later, wrapped in the towel, another smaller one draped around his neck. His hair was dark and wet, curling slightly at the nape of his neck. Droplets of water clung to his shoulders and the dusting of dark hair on his chest. My eyes snagged there for a moment too long, and I quickly looked away, my face hot. I had seen him shirtless before, years ago, at pool parties at Chloe's parents' house, but this was different. This was my bathroom, my towel, my apartment. The context made it charged, dangerous. I borrowed some of your sweatpants, he said, gesturing to the gray fleece pants he was wearing. They were my biggest pair, but they were still too short on him, ending a few inches above his ankles. Hope you don't mind. No, of course not, I said, my voice tight. I handed him a mug of tea. Our fingers brushed as he took it, a fleeting, electric contact that sent a jolt up my arm. His skin was warm, solid. I snatched my hand back as if I'd been burned. He didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign. He just brought the mug to his lips, his eyes closing for a moment as he inhaled the steam. This is good. Thanks, Leo. His voice was softer now, stripped of the weariness it held at the door. We sat in a strained silence for a few moments, the only sounds the relentless drumming of the rain and the soft clink of his mug against the coffee table. He was on the armchair, and I was on the couch, the piece of furniture he would soon be sleeping on. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. His presence was a physical weight in the room, a constant, low-level hum of awareness in my nervous system. I was acutely conscious of every small movement he made, the way he stretched his long legs out in front of him, the quiet sound of his breathing, the way his thumb stroked the ceramic of his mug. I spent those first few days in a state of hyper-awareness. The storm didn't break. It settled over the city like a wet, gray blanket, grounding all flights indefinitely. Julian's one night on my couch stretched into 2, then 3. He became a temporary, unexpected roommate, a ghost in the machine of my meticulously ordered life. And I became an observer, a chronicler of his habits. I watched him. I told myself it was just proximity, that it was impossible not to notice another human being in a space as small as mine. But it was more than that. It was a revival of an old, dormant fascination. I watched the way he made coffee in the morning, his movements efficient and precise, a stark contrast to my own fumbling attempts. He'd stand by the window, mug in hand, and watch the rain, his expression unreadable. I'd sit at my desk, pretending to work on a logo design, but my eyes would drift to his reflection in the dark screen of my monitor. I learned the rhythm of his days. He spent hours on the phone with the airline, his voice calm and professional, a smooth, authoritative tone that was completely at odds with the casual, easygoing man who padded around my apartment in borrowed sweatpants. When he wasn't on the phone, he read the books from my shelves, his brow furrowed in concentration. He had a quiet intensity that I found captivating. He didn't fill the silence with idle chatter. He inhabited it, comfortably, as if it were a space he was used to. My apartment, once a fortress of solitude, began to transform. It started to smell like him. That clean, sharp cologne, the faint scent of the coffee he brewed, something uniquely, indefinably Julian. His pilot's jacket hung on the back of my desk chair. His worn leather boots sat by the door next to my sneakers. These small incursions into my space should have felt like a violation, but they didn't. They felt right. Terrifyingly so. My internal monologue, usually a quiet stream of self-deprecating thoughts and project deadlines, became a constant, running commentary on Julian Thorne. He smiled when I handed him his toast. Was that just a polite smile, or was there something else in his eyes? He stood a little too close when he was looking at the painting over my desk. Did he feel it too? That strange, invisible current that seemed to arc between us? I was dissecting his every word, his every micro-expression, searching for a meaning that probably wasn't there. It was exhausting. It was exhilarating. The physical space between us was a landscape I was constantly navigating. My kitchen was a narrow galley, a one-person operation. Now, it was a space of near-constant, accidental intimacy. We'd brush past each other reaching for the milk in the fridge. His arm would graze my back as he squeezed by to get to the sink. Each touch was a small, explosive event, a spark on my skin that lingered long after he'd moved away. I'd find myself holding my breath, my muscles tensed, waiting for the next inevitable, accidental contact. One afternoon, on the third day of his stay, the tension coalesced into a single, sharp moment. I was making lunch, chopping vegetables with more force than was strictly necessary, trying to work out some of the nervous energy that had taken up permanent residence in my chest. He came to stand beside me, leaning against the counter, watching my hands. "You're good at that," he said, his voice a low murmur next to my ear. I jumped, the knife slipping slightly. "Don't sneak up on me like that." He chuckled, a warm, easy sound. "Sorry. Didn't mean to startle you." He didn't move away. He stayed there, his shoulder just inches from mine. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, a tangible heat that seemed to seep into my own skin. I kept my eyes fixed on the cutting board, on the bright orange of the carrots. "Chloe always said you were the quiet, artistic type," he continued, his tone conversational. "She said you see things other people miss." My hand stilled. I could feel his gaze on the side of my face. I risked a glance at him. He was looking at me, his blue eyes direct and searching. It felt like he was seeing straight through me, past the carefully constructed walls of my quiet life, into the messy, yearning core of me. "I just pay attention," I mumbled, turning back to the carrots. "Yeah," he said, his voice soft. "I'm starting to realize that." He reached over then, his hand covering mine on the knife handle. His fingers were long and warm, his grip firm but gentle. "Let me," he said. "You look like you're about to chop your own finger off." My breath hitched. His touch was electric, a sudden, overwhelming surge of sensation. I could feel the calluses on his palm, the slight pressure of his thumb against my knuckles. It was a simple, practical gesture, but my body reacted as if it were the most intimate caress I had ever known. I relinquished the knife, my hand falling uselessly to my side. He took my place at the cutting board, his movements deft and sure. I just stood there, my heart hammering against my ribs, the ghost of his touch still burning on my skin. I was in so much trouble. The days bled into one another, a seamless expanse of gray skies and shared silences. The apartment became our world, a small, self-contained universe governed by the storm. We fell into a strange, domestic rhythm. I would wake to the smell of coffee, and he would already be up, sitting in the armchair by the window, a book open in his lap. I would work at my desk, the quiet click of my mouse a counterpoint to the soft rustle of pages turning. In the evenings, we'd make dinner together, a clumsy but comfortable dance in the small kitchen, and then we'd watch old movies, the flickering light of the television casting long shadows across the room. It was during one of these evenings that something shifted. We were on the couch, a respectable distance between us, watching some black and white noir film I'd seen a dozen times. The hero was all sharp angles and cynical one-liners, the femme fatale a swirl of smoke and secrets. But I wasn't paying attention to the movie. I was preternaturally aware of Julian beside me. His arm was stretched out along the back of the couch, his hand resting just behind my shoulder. Not touching, but the proximity was a constant, low-grade hum against my skin. He shifted, and his fingers brushed against the collar of my shirt. It was nothing, a fleeting, incidental contact. But it was enough. A shiver traced its way down my spine. I tried to focus on the screen, on the crackle of the dialogue, but all I could think about was the warmth of his hand, the potential energy contained in that small space between his skin and mine. He must have felt me tense up, because he spoke, his voice a low murmur that barely carried over the sound of the movie. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said, my voice too tight. "Fine." He didn't press. He just left his hand there, a silent, weighty presence. The air between us grew thick with unspoken things. The tension wasn't just mine anymore. I could feel it radiating from him, too. It was in the stillness of his body, the way he seemed to be holding his breath. The silence stretched, filled only by the dramatic swell of the film's score. Then, he moved again, slowly, deliberately. His fingers grazed my neck, a touch so light it was barely there, a ghost of a caress. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't accidental this time. It couldn't have been. It was a question, asked without words. My heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. I should have pulled away, made a joke, broken the spell. It would have been the safe thing to do, the smart thing. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by a terrifying, exhilarating hope. I leaned back, a minuscule movement, just a fraction of an inch, closing the distance. It was all the answer he needed. His hand settled on my shoulder, his thumb stroking the tense muscle there, a slow, circular motion that sent waves of heat through my body. We sat like that for a long time, not speaking, not looking at each other, just connected by that single point of contact, while the movie played on, a forgotten ghost in the room. The world had shrunk to the space on my couch, to the weight of his hand, to the sound of our shared breathing. That night, something had irrevocably broken between us. The fragile pretense of casual friendship, of a convenient lodging arrangement, had been shattered by a single, deliberate touch. The next morning, the air was different. It was charged, heavy with a new kind of awareness. We avoided each other's eyes as we moved around the kitchen, a strange, shy dance of near misses and averted gazes. The easy camaraderie of the past few days had been replaced by a taut, humming silence. I felt like I was walking on a wire, every movement, every word, fraught with a terrifying new potential. The crush I had harbored for years, the safe, theoretical affection for a man who existed at a distance, had become a real and present danger. It was no longer a fossil. It was alive, breathing, and it was sitting across the breakfast table from me, looking devastatingly handsome in my faded college sweatshirt. He was the one who finally broke the silence. He was leaning against the counter, nursing a mug of coffee, his expression thoughtful. I was pretending to be engrossed in the pattern of the wood grain on the table. "Do you ever get lonely here?" he asked, his voice quiet. The question was so direct, so unexpected, that it knocked the air out of my lungs. I looked up, meeting his gaze for the first time that morning. His blue eyes were serious, stripped of their usual easy charm. He wasn't making small talk. He was asking something real. I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm used to it. I like the quiet," it was a half-truth. I liked the control, the predictability. The loneliness was just the price of admission. He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the window, to the rain-streaked glass. "I get it. My life is the opposite. Always moving, always surrounded by people. Cockpits, airports, hotel bars. It's a different kind of lonely." He looked back at me, a flicker of something vulnerable in his eyes. "Sometimes I think I've spent the last 10 years in a holding pattern, just circling, never actually landing anywhere." It was the most he had ever revealed about himself, a crack in the confident, unflappable facade. For the first time, I saw him not as Julian Thorne, the impossibly perfect pilot, Chloe's golden older brother, but as just a man who was maybe just as lost as I was. A strange, protective instinct flared in my chest. "This is the longest I've stayed in one place that wasn't a hotel in years," he added, a small, self-deprecating smile touching his lips. "You might have to start charging me rent." "The couch is all-inclusive," I said, managing a weak smile in return. The moment of vulnerability passed, but it left something in its wake. The tension was still there, but it was softer now, less anxious, more inquisitive. We had shown each other a small piece of our true selves, and the world hadn't ended. The wire I was walking on suddenly felt a little wider, a little more stable. Later that day, his phone rang. It was Chloe. He put her on speaker, a habit he'd developed over the past few days, so I could say hello. "So, are you two driving each other crazy yet?" she asked, her voice bright and teasing. "Has Leo forced you to alphabetize his spice rack?" "He's a gracious host," Julian said, his eyes finding mine across the room. There was a playful glint in them, though his taste in old movies is questionable. "Hey," I protested, laughing. "I'm just glad you're not stuck in some soulless airport hotel," Chloe continued. "It's nice that you have a friend there." There was that word again. Friend. The way she said it was so simple, so innocent. But the way Julian looked at me when he heard it was anything but. A strange, unreadable expression crossed his face. He held my gaze for a long moment, a silent conversation passing between us that I couldn't begin to decipher. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice a little rough. "It's nice." After the call, the atmosphere in the apartment shifted again. The soft, inquisitive tension of the morning had sharpened, honed to a fine, dangerous edge. The unspoken thing between us was no longer a quiet hum. It was a roar, a deafening silence that filled every corner of the room. We were orbiting each other, caught in a gravitational pull that was growing stronger by the hour. I felt like a planet about to be torn apart by the force. The tipping point came that evening. We were cleaning up after dinner, moving in the tight confines of the kitchen. The familiar, awkward dance. I was at the sink, my back to him, washing dishes. I could feel him behind me, drying, putting things away. The space was filled with the small, domestic sounds of clinking plates and running water. Leo. His voice was low, right behind me. I froze, my hands submerged in the warm, soapy water. "You're always watching me," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. "What are you looking for?" My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. The confrontation I had been dreading and, on some secret, masochistic level, craving. I couldn't turn around. I couldn't face him. I kept my eyes fixed on the suds in the sink, on the swirl of colors in the dish soap. "I don't know what you mean," I lied, my voice thin and reedy. I felt him take a step closer. The heat of his body was a solid presence at my back. I could feel the fabric of his t-shirt brush against my own. "I think you do," he said, his voice a soft murmur that vibrated through me. "I see the way you look at me when you think I'm not paying attention. It's the same way I look at you." The world stopped. The sound of the rain, the hum of the refrigerator, my own frantic pulse, it all faded away. There was only his voice, his words, hanging in the air between us. He looked at me the same way. The thought was a seismic shock, a fundamental reordering of my universe. The hope I had been so carefully suppressing, the wild, impossible hope, surged through me, so powerful it made me dizzy. I turned off the water, my movements slow, robotic. I dried my hands on a dish towel, my fingers trembling. I had to turn around. I had to see his face. I had to know if he was telling the truth. Slowly, I turned to face him. He was so close. I could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes, the faint shadow of stubble on his jaw, the small scar just above his eyebrow. His expression was open, vulnerable, the same look he'd had that morning when he'd talked about being lonely. But now, it was directed at me, and it was mingled with something else, something that looked terrifyingly like affection. "Jules," I whispered, his name a prayer on my lips. He didn't say anything. He just lifted his hand, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw, his touch feather-light. His thumb brushed against my lower lip, and a shudder went through me. My carefully constructed walls, the fortress I had spent years building around my heart, crumbled to dust in an instant. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his eyes searching mine. "Tell me I'm reading this wrong, and I'll stop." I couldn't speak. I could only shake my head, a small, jerky movement. The unspoken thing, the roaring silence between us, had finally found its voice, and it was saying yes. That was all the permission he needed. He closed the small distance between us, his other hand coming up to cup the back of my neck. And then he kissed me. It wasn't a frantic, desperate kiss. It was slow, gentle, almost hesitant, as if he was giving me one last chance to pull away. It was a question. The taste of him was coffee and something uniquely his own, a taste I felt I had been waiting my whole life to know. My hands came up to rest on his chest, my fingers curling into the soft cotton of his shirt. I could feel the steady, solid beat of his heart beneath my palm. I leaned into him, answering his question with one of my own. The pressure of his lips deepened, and the kiss transformed, shifting from tentative to certain. It was a kiss of recognition, of years of unspoken longing finally given a voice. It was relief. It was a homecoming. The roaring in my ears subsided, replaced by a profound, startling quiet. All the noise, all the anxiety, all the overthinking that had plagued me for days, for years, it all just stopped. There was only this. The warmth of his mouth, the solid presence of his body against mine, the feeling of being seen, truly seen, for the first time. When he finally pulled back, it was only by an inch. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes still closed. His breathing was unsteady, matching my own. We stood there for a long moment, locked in our own small universe in the middle of my kitchen, the half-washed dishes forgotten in the sink. "Leo," he breathed, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. I opened my eyes. His were still closed, his dark lashes stark against his skin. I reached up, my hand trembling slightly, and traced the line of his eyebrow, the small scar. He was real. This was real. He opened his eyes then, and the blue in them was so deep, so intense, it felt like I could fall into it and never find my way out. He didn't smile. He just looked at me, a searching, serious gaze that held a universe of unspoken things. "I've wanted to do that," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper, "since the moment you opened the door." A shaky laugh escaped me. "You hit it well. I'm a pilot," he said, a ghost of his usual smile finally appearing. "I'm good at maintaining a calm exterior during periods of extreme turbulence." I laced my fingers with his, my hand feeling small and lost in his larger one. His grip was firm, reassuring. It felt like an anchor in the storm, both the one raging outside and the one that had just broken inside of me. We had crossed a line, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that there was no going back. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't want to. I woke the next morning to an unfamiliar silence. The relentless drumming of the rain had finally ceased. A pale, watery sunlight was filtering through the blinds, painting stripes of light across my bedroom wall. For a moment, I was disoriented, my mind still thick with sleep and the lingering haze of dreams that had been filled with the taste of coffee and the feeling of a warm hand in mine. Then, reality crashed in. Julian. The kiss. The quiet, earth-shattering confession in my kitchen. A flush of heat spread through my chest, a mixture of giddy joy and sheer, unadulterated panic. I sat up, my heart starting to pound a nervous rhythm. The apartment was too quiet. The usual morning sounds, the clink of the coffee pot, the soft footsteps on the hardwood floor, were absent. A cold dread began to seep into the warmth in my chest. I threw back the covers and padded out of my bedroom. The living room was empty. The blankets on the couch were folded neatly, the pillow plumped and set in the corner. His pilot's bag, the one he had dropped by the door with such finality days ago, was gone. Panic, sharp and blinding, seized me. He was gone. He had left while I was sleeping. The kiss, the confession, the breathtaking vulnerability in his eyes. Had I imagined it all? Was it just a fleeting moment of storm-induced madness? The quiet apartment, which had felt so full and alive for the past few days, now seemed cavernous, echoing with his absence. The loneliness I had grown so accustomed to rushed back in, a tidal wave of familiar, aching emptiness. It was worse this time, so much worse, because now I knew what I was missing. I sank onto the edge of the couch, the one he had slept on, and buried my face in my hands. The cushions still held the faint, lingering scent of him. It was a cruel, ghostly reminder. I felt like a fool. Of course he had left. He was Julian Thorne. He had a life of flight schedules and exotic destinations, a life that was constantly in motion. I was just a quiet, stationary port in a storm. The storm had passed, and so had he. I sat there for I don't know how long, a hollow ache in my chest. I felt the sting of tears behind my eyes, hot and shameful. I hadn't cried in years. I wouldn't cry now. I took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to pull myself together, to rebuild the walls he had so effortlessly demolished. Then I heard it, a faint sound from the kitchen, the quiet click of a mug being set on the counter. My head snapped up. I stood slowly, my legs unsteady. I crept toward the kitchen, my heart in my throat. I peered around the doorframe. He was there. He was standing by the window, his back to me, holding a mug of coffee. He was dressed in his uniform, the crisp black fabric a stark contrast to the soft, borrowed clothes he'd been wearing for days. His bag was on the floor by his feet. He wasn't gone. Not yet. The relief was so sudden, so overwhelming, that my knees felt weak. He must have heard me, because he turned. His face was unreadable, his expression guarded. The easy intimacy of the night before was gone, replaced by a familiar, awkward tension. "Morning," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I thought you left," I breathed, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. A flicker of something, regret, surprise, crossed his face. "The airline called an hour ago. The storm broke. They're trying to get flights back on schedule. I have a plane to catch this evening." He paused, his gaze dropping to the mug in his hands. "I went for a walk, to clear my head. The morning after. The awkward, terrifying morning after." We stood in silence for a long moment, the space between us charged with the memory of the kiss. I was terrified to speak, to say the wrong thing, to shatter the fragile, beautiful thing that had happened between us. He took a step toward me, closing some of the distance. "Leo," he started, then stopped, running a hand through his hair. He looked uncertain. Julian Thorne, the man who flew giant metal birds through the sky, looked as lost and scared as I felt. "Last night," he said, his voice low. I don't regret it. I just don't know what it means." "Me neither," I admitted, my voice a whisper. He took another step until he was standing right in front of me. He reached out, not to kiss me, but to take my hand. His fingers laced through mine, his grip firm, grounding. The simple touch was a reassurance, a confirmation. It was real. "I didn't leave," he said, his blue eyes meeting mine. "I wouldn't do that." And just like that, the panic receded, replaced by a quiet, fragile hope. We didn't know what it meant. We didn't know where we were going. But we were here, now, holding hands in my sun-drenched kitchen, and for the moment, that was enough. The rest of the day passed in a strange, bittersweet haze. The ticking clock of his impending departure was a constant presence, lending a precious, fleeting quality to every moment. We didn't talk about the kiss again. We didn't try to define what was happening between us. We just were. We made breakfast together, a quiet, comfortable dance that was no longer awkward. We sat on the couch and read, his leg pressed against mine, a simple, constant point of contact that spoke volumes. The apartment was filled with a new kind of silence, not the tense, humming silence of before, but a soft, contented quiet. It was the silence of two people who were comfortable in each other's presence, who didn't need words to fill the space between them. The hours slipped away too quickly. Before I knew it, it was late afternoon, the sun casting long golden shadows across the floor. It was time for him to go. He stood by the door, his pilot's bag slung over his shoulder. He looked just as he had the night he arrived, a handsome stranger in a uniform. But he wasn't a stranger anymore. I knew the feel of his hand in mine, the sound of his laughter, the vulnerable look in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. "So," he said, his voice a little rough. "This is it." "Yeah," I said, my own voice tight. "This is it." The goodbye hung in the air between us, a clumsy, inadequate word. What do you say to the person who has turned your entire world upside down in the space of a few days? "Thank you for staying. It was nice having you. Don't go." He reached out and tucked a stray piece of hair behind my ear, his fingers brushing against my cheek. "Thank you, Leo," he said softly. "For the couch. For everything. Anytime." I managed, my throat thick with unspoken words. He held my gaze for a long, heart-stopping moment, and I thought he was going to kiss me again. I wanted him to. I wanted him to kiss me and tell me that this wasn't the end, that it was just the beginning. But he just gave me a small, sad smile, his hand dropping from my face. He turned and opened the door. He took one step out into the hallway, and my heart plummeted. This was it. He was walking away. He was going back to his life of motion and sky, and I was staying here, in my quiet, lonely apartment, with nothing but the ghost of him for company. But then he stopped. He stood in the doorway, his back to me, for a long moment. I could see the tension in his shoulders. Then, with a quiet sigh, he turned back around. He stepped back inside, closing the door behind him. He dropped his bag to the floor with a familiar, decisive thud. He looked at me, his expression serious, determined. "This is stupid," he said, his voice firm. "This doesn't have to be the end of this." Hope, wild and fierce, flared in my chest. "It doesn't." "No," he said, taking a step toward me. "I'm based out of Chicago. It's a 2-hour flight. I have layovers here all the time. And I have vacation days. A lot of them." He took another step, until he was standing right in front of me again. "I want to see you again, Leo. Not just when a storm grounds my flight. I want to choose to be here. With you." It was a conscious choice. A deliberate decision. He wasn't being pushed by circumstance. He was pulling toward me. The realization was breathtaking. "I want that too," I whispered, the words feeling impossibly large, impossibly true. He smiled then, a real, brilliant smile that lit up his whole face and made the breath catch in my throat. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He didn't call the airline to cancel his flight. He called to reschedule it. For the next morning. "It seems," he said, his eyes twinkling as he put the phone away, "that I have one more night in town." He didn't sleep on the couch that night. He slept in my bed, with me. There was no frantic passion, no desperate rush. It was quiet and slow and breathtakingly intimate. It was the simple, profound act of two people choosing to be close. I fell asleep with his arm around me, his steady breathing a quiet rhythm in the darkness, feeling, for the first time in my life, like I wasn't alone. Like I had finally come home. The next morning, when he left for his rescheduled flight, the goodbye was different. It wasn't an ending. It was a pause. He kissed me at the door, a deep, lingering kiss that was full of promise. "I'll call you when I land," he said. "Okay," I said, smiling. "And Leo," he added, his hand on the doorknob. "Next time, I'm taking you out to dinner. A real date. No borrowed sweatpants allowed." I laughed. "It's a deal." And then he was gone. I stood in the doorway and watched him walk down the hall until he disappeared around the corner. I closed the door and leaned against it, a slow smile spreading across my face. The apartment was quiet again, but it wasn't an empty quiet. It was a peaceful quiet, filled with the echo of his laughter, the memory of his touch, the promise of his return. I walked into the kitchen and saw two coffee mugs by the sink, his and mine. I picked his up, the ceramic still faintly warm. I looked around my small apartment, at the stacks of books, the art prints, the indentation on the armchair where he used to sit and read. It was still my space, my sanctuary. But it wasn't a fortress anymore. It was just a home that was waiting for someone to come back to it. The sun was streaming through the window, bright and clear. The storm was over, and my life, my quiet, predictable, lonely life, was just beginning. I felt a sense of calm settle over me, a deep, abiding peace. We would figure it out. Together.